Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited about our discussion today, which we've entitled Reports of the Death of DEI Are Greatly Exaggerated. And I'm excited to dive into that with Professor Jacobson and with both of y'all. I'm just going to go over very quickly the general program for today and a handful of housekeeping things. Um, you will notice at the bottom in terms of participation, we have two opportunities to engage with us today, and we encourage you to do so. We have a chat function, and that's purely just for your commentary throughout this discussion. Please feel free to engage with other attendees. We enjoy that. We usually have really great discussion happening in the chat throughout these events. We do just ask that you keep it on topic. That's not an issue so far that we've ever had, but the mom and me feels compelled to say things like that. So, towards the end of the program, we will be answering your questions, and we intentionally set these things up so that we're able to answer as many questions as are possible, but also keep it brief and succinct. We know for many of you it's your lunch hour, and we want to be respectful of your time. For questions that you have for either myself or Professor Jacobson, please put those in the Q&A section, which is different from the chat. I will be monitoring that throughout the duration of the program, and we will get to as many questions as we possibly can today. I will also be putting links in the chat as it makes sense to do so, covering some of the work that we have done in this area, and just to provide more information and context as that makes sense to do so. So really, I think what we're going to do, Professor Jacobson is going to begin by sharing a lot about what we're seeing with the current administration, the work that we've done in that space. Then I will speak briefly or briefer about the work that we're doing and some of the projects that I help to oversee and what we're seeing in our research there. And then we're going to spend as much time as we can taking your questions. So I'll go ahead and introduce my boss. This is William Jacobson, and he is the president and founder of the Legal Insurrection Foundation when he is not busy working as a law professor in a security law clinic at Cornell's Law School.
Thank you, Kimberly, and welcome to everybody. Looks like we have a pretty good turnout, which is good because I think there's a lot of interest in this subject. Just to give you a preview, I'm going to talk about what has happened so far, executive actions. I actually have a slideshow, which is really rare for me at these events. I usually just talk, and I'll walk through those, and I'll show you what's happened, and I'll show you what some of the reactions have been. The reason we scheduled this program is there's so much going on, and so much of it is good that I feel there's almost like a little bit of an over exuberance about it. And I was on a radio show talking about how we can't let our guard down. DEI is not over just because the president signed some executive orders. So we can't say it's, DEI is dead. And so when they post the interview, what do they title it? DEI is dead. So no, a lot of progress. And I'll give you the punchline now. Enormously impactful things have been done, but nobody should think this is going away. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work with my PowerPoint. And if you cannot see it, please flag for Kimberly or for others that, so that we can get it proper. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, and you see the slideshow here. Is there anybody who is not? Let Kimberly know, and she can let me know if you can't see it. So reports of the death of DEI have been greatly exaggerated, is obviously taking off on a very famous line that the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. And so first I'm going to go through executive orders, focusing really on race-related things. There have been a number of executive orders on gender ideology and things like that. That's not really core to what we do at Equal Protection Project or Critical Race. And I'm going to focus mostly on race-related executive orders and talk about the impact of them. The first one that President Trump signed, I think it was the afternoon after he got sworn in, I think he signed it in the Oval Office, was rescinding prior executive orders. So that's a classic presidential move. And among the ones he rescinded were the 2021 and 2023 Biden executive orders, which pushed what they called racial equity deep, deep, deep into the federal bureaucracy. So most of what we're seeing now until a month ago in the federal bureaucracy was a direct result of Joe Biden's executive orders. And DEI, racial measurements, all those things were required. And so what Trump did is rescind those, which also had the impact of essentially ending affirmative action and DEI in the federal bureaucracy. He also signed another executive order. This one may have been that night when he was in the arena and he was signing things on stage, directing Office of Management and Budget to terminate all DEI mandates, et cetera, in whatever name they appear throughout the federal government, and also requiring the agencies to report back to him, I forget if it was 60 or 90 days, on all employment positions in the federal government. So what this did, the combination of these two things, eliminated the structural racial equity agenda in the federal government, and also ended all DEI mandates, policies, et cetera. And that's bigger than you think, because what people are now waking up to is the fact that much of what we've seen was funded by the federal government. When the federal government maintains grant programs and other programs and contracting programs and all of those things, it forces that into the private sector. So with two executive orders, he really eliminated the federal bureaucracy and took more steps to eliminate it that was behind DEI. So that's hugely impactful because and it has a ripple effect because employment in various federal agencies, various federal contractors elsewhere for DEI positions has seriously been damaged and gone away. So a whole industry, and we've covered this at the Critical Race website, our criticalrace.org website, there are 40 some odd certificate programs in DEI. So you would get these certificates, they're non-professional degrees, and that would help your career, no more. And we're going to be tracking at CRT what has become of these programs. Cornell has one of the most active, by the way, or at least they did the last time we checked.
They have 6 programs for anyone counting. Cornell alone makes up 6 of the DEI certificate programs.
6 of the 49 was
Yeah.
just Cornell. And it'll be very curious to see what happens. So the next one he signed, which was also that day, was federal hiring. No more federal hiring based on race, sex, or religion. And so again, what he's doing is he's deconstructing, that's a favorite term of the left, he's deconstructing the federal bureaucracy geared towards supporting and funding DEI initiatives. And so I can't tell you how important that is because some of the executive orders he rescinded on day one dated back decades. The key ones were the Biden ones, but there were others that dated back decades. And these are areas where, as far as I know, he has not been challenged in court. To the extent the executive, the president, addresses the federal executive branch and federal bureaucracy, he's at his most powerful and least likely to be challenged, at least challenged successfully. So I'm pretty sure this is right. None of the dozens and dozens and dozens of lawsuits that have been filed seeking TROs, to my knowledge, go to what I've just covered, which is the restructuring of the executive branch when it comes to DEI. And that is just enormous. I can't really tell you how powerful that is. He also, uh, the next day, uh, directed that federal affirmative action programs terminate and barred DEI discrimination in federal contracting and grant making. You have no idea how many hundreds of millions to billions of dollars has flowed to contractors, to so-called non-governmental organizations. Now, if you're a non-governmental organization and all of your money comes from the government, I'm not so sure you're a non-governmental organization. But any of us who have worked in the sphere, in the parents' rights movement, in the parent conferences, we bump into the consultant class all the time. He has defunded a significant portion of the consultant class, which develops the programs. And when you're in your K through 12 school and you see some group you've never heard of, which is coming up with all this crazy stuff, and you're wondering where they're getting the money, a lot of them were getting the money from the federal government. Not all of them. There certainly are private foundations that fund this, but a lot of it, and I'll show you some of what's been eliminated, a lot of it came from the federal government. So this is just reiterating my point. He has deconstructed without any challenge, and I don't believe this order has been challenged at all either. He has deconstructed the federal funding of what I call the DEI industrial complex. He also has continued in that same order, directed the Attorney General to prepare a report, and he's asked every agency to identify 9 targets for investigation. I don't know if that means 9 per agency or 9 in total. The way it's worded, I think it's 9 per agency. So there are probably going to be 80 to 100 plus entities, which are publicly traded corporations, large nonprofits with assets of 500 million. I have one in mind. Maybe you'll read about it in the near future. State and local bar and medical associations. Your local bar association may be a target. I think the American Bar Association probably will be. Medical associations, we have our CRT database on medical schools, and there are other groups out there that cover medical schools. Some of the worst in the country is the medical establishment and institutions of higher education with endowments over $1 billion. This is incredibly important because while it doesn't take any action in and of itself, it seems to be a precursor to action affecting the private sector directly. So what I've gone over prior to right now are things that affect the federal government, where it's at the chief executive of the executive branch, the president, also known as the president, is at his most powerful. It's going to be very interesting to see how he's able to shift this into the private sector. I think based on the wording of this, and the Department of Justice issued a memo, which I'll get to, announcing that they're putting their list together. Everybody's making their list and checking it twice. That's where the real fight is going to be. And one of the things I want to emphasize here, why DEI is not dead, contrary to reports, is it's going to be much harder to shift this sort of action into the private sector than it has been in the federal government. And that's where I think the fights are going to be ahead, both legally and culturally. He also abolished DEI in the military, which is hugely important because the military sets the tone for a lot of the country. We do have a database on the military service academies, and the way I always described it is that CRT/DEI had a beachhead in the military academies. It had not dominated it the way it dominated private universities and higher ed, but that's gone away. I mean, that's going away, and I think that will have very strong impact beyond the military academies, that he's eliminated essentially not just DEI bureaucracy, but also the teaching of DEI. He has a lot of power to do that in the military academies. Not sure how much power he's going to have to do that in higher education. He also issued more recently, January 29, a executive order addressing K through 12. Now, this is more of a plan. So he has asked for a plan to be developed to eliminate federal funding or support for discriminatory treatment in K through 12. While K through 12 hasn't been a huge focus of ours, we have had a couple of K through 12 cases that we've brought against Ithaca Public School District and Providence Public School District. Most of what we've done is focused on higher ed. I think K through 12 is going to be a bigger deal, and certainly there are other groups that have dealt with K through 12. I think that's going to be a bigger deal moving forward. And this is another one where is he going to be able to push the agenda down to K through 12? That remains to be seen, but that's going to be one of the fault lines and one of the battles that are going to be faced. The federal government has also issued some guidance, so not executive orders, but guidance that have an impact. There's an Office of Policy Management, I think that's what OPM stands for, issued in February with regard to removing diversity requirements for hiring panels and candidate pools, and essentially getting DEI out of the hiring process in the federal government. Again, that's something he's got wide power to do. I don't believe this has been challenged at all. But again, it's deconstructing the industry that feeds everything else. The Attorney General also issued a memo on ending illegal DEI and DEIA discrimination. And this is the Department of Justice announcing that they are putting together their list. Remember, we have the list that each department is supposed to prepare, and that they are going to investigate, eliminate, and penalize illegal DEI and DEIA. I forget what the A stands for, but there's all sorts of new acronyms, preferences, mandates, policies, etc., when it comes to providing federal funds to education. So this is another one where the federal government has a lot of power. Whether they can force a school to do something is one thing, but they can certainly condition funding on complying with these laws. I mean, that's well established, a well-known Supreme Court case involving the Solomon Amendment, which I don't have time to get into, but you have no constitutional right to federal funding. And if you want to take the funding, I'm sure there's a limitation, but you have to accept the terms and conditions on which it's offered by the federal government. So that's going to be another way to gain compliance, is to condition funding on compliance with the anti-discrimination laws. OCR, Office for Civil Rights, where we are very familiar with, where we have filed over 60 complaints, including one this morning against University of San Diego that's in the media. And they issued guidance, a so-called Dear Colleague letter on February 14th, just last Friday, which has really shaken the education establishment to the core, because one of the legal issues, which has not been litigated, but is out there, is how far does Students for Fair Admissions, the affirmative action ruling, go? Does it also apply to scholarships? Does it also apply to other programming? And this, while it hasn't been litigated, it's always been our position that Students for Fair Admission is an Equal Protection and Civil Rights Act decision. Any place those two laws apply, Students for Fair Admissions applies. And the key thing there in Students for Fair Admissions, they reiterated what I believe the law already was, but they put it any doubt to rest, that the goal of diversity is not a sufficient compelling state interest in order to justify racial discrimination. So this one in particular, if you read the news media, has really shaken up higher ed. They're very worried about this because it would affect more than admissions to the university. and how, and this is just guidance, but what they signaled in the guidance is that there would be enforcement activity if these programs are not eliminated within 14 days of the date the guidance was issued, so February 28th. And you're going to see this in the news a lot, and how universities are reacting to it. They're trying to figure out what to do. But this is hugely, hugely important. And it's also important for what we do, how OCR continues. The fact that OCR is issuing this guidance leads me to think they're going to continue OCR as a function of the Department of Education. Might be a severely shrunken Department of Education, but it will continue. If not, it probably will go over to Department of Justice, but this is the guidance they will be following. And I don't think this document would have been issued if they did not plan on following through with it. Funding cuts, everything I've just talked about has led up to the choking off of funds flowing to the DEI industrial complex. And I know I've done a hot take on the website and video about this. The cutting of funding is probably the single most important thing, most impactful thing the Trump administration has done and is doing, because there is just so much money out there. Anybody who operates in this area, in the parents area, in the K through 12 and higher ed, we're constantly amazed at how much money there is on the other side. Contrary to what some senators might tell you about, dark right-wing dark money, the money flowing to the left on these things is outsized 100 times over. So $600 million, it's been announced in Department of Education funding to teacher training programs that they consider to be divisive has been cut. Those are the trainings where they may not say in the title of the training, we're going to teach you critical race theory, but that's in effect what they do. Cut $350 million in grants that fund programs such as equity audits. Anybody who's operated in K through 12 knows equity audits are the gateway drug to all of this bad content that comes in. It's the excuse used to push CRT and DEI into K through 12. 350 million gone. 400. Then there were some that are just I don't know why we were funding DEI scholarships in Burma, and a lot of others, and you can see them here. These are just examples. Diversity workshops in agriculture. For some reason, we were funding a Brazilian forest and gender consultant. But the point is, over $1 billion in funding for the DEI industrial complex has now been eliminated. And I don't think this can be challenged. These are federal programs, federal grants. I have not heard of it being challenged. And this is going to put, frankly, a world of hurt on the consultant class, the people who have built their careers around proselytizing on CRT and DEI, funded in significant part by the federal government. Now, we know that left-wing philanthropists have billions of dollars to commit. But this is $1 billion plus already in 30 days taken off the table. That's going to be hard to replace. Legal fights, and this is where it's going to get interesting. So the reason DEI is not dead is there are going to be fights as the Trump administration tries to push their mandates down to K through 12 and into the private sector. Already, there's National Association of Diversity Officers has filed a lawsuit in Maryland, set for a preliminary injunction hearing actually today. And it has to do with whether these DEI directives violate the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, whether it's a taking without justification, without due process. I can't see how that's successful, but First Amendment is where you're going to see the fights. You can't force me to espouse your viewpoint on DEI, that I have the right to free, and it's a free speech violation. Attorney generals are gathering to defend this stuff. There was January 31, 12 state attorney generals vowed to fight the DEI, anti-DEI initiatives. And in another letter, more recently, 16 attorney generals at the state level vowed to fight it as well. So there is a gathering force on the other side organizing to fight this. Um, Legal battles coming up, a preview. There is a legal defense fund that has been created to provide money to nonprofits that are challenged on their DEI uh, uh, practices, to hire lawyers, essentially. They'll claim First Amendment rights and they'll continue to fight. So there are going to be a lot of lawsuits. They just haven't popped up as much yet because the push to get this into the private sector and get it down to K-12 and into private universities is really just starting. Um, they're advising people how to get around the law. We've seen reports, and we've had reports on rebranding. Kimberly may mention that. Hiding it, shifting people around, changing the language, taking things off of websites. Anybody who's on a college campus, and I am, can tell you this is not going to go away. There is an entrenched, not just bureaucracy, that's understating it. It is an entrenched ideology. There are true believers who really, honestly, truly believe that what they are doing is virtuous, that what we are doing in trying to gain a race neutral posture is not virtuous. You should see my inbox. I've been told I need mental health help. And so they're really true believers. They are virtue signaling. They really are gathering up to fight and to hide it. It's the campuses, professional organizations, our American Association of University Professors, I believe, has filed a lawsuit. The teachers' unions are going to be filing lawsuits. This fight is not over. And that's the point of this webinar. Enormous progress has been made. I don't want to understate it or play it down. Truly enormous, impactful things have been done. But nobody should think this is going away. This is going to be a years-long fight. So you can applaud what's happened if you're in favor of it, but don't let down your guard. Don't say, okay, we've checked that box and now we're going to move on. So I think I have filled up my quota of time. And Kimberly will now talk, and then we'll have time for some questions.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I always appreciate how well you explain some of these things in ways that everyone can understand. So I appreciate that. So my name is Kimberly Kay, and if we have not met or spoken, I am the operations and editorial director with the Legal Insurrection Foundation, and I've had the privilege of working with Professor Jacobson for almost 11 years now, which is just kind of crazy to think. But one of the programs that we do, one of the bodies of research that I oversee and help keep moving along is the critical race site that Bill has mentioned a couple times, and that's criticalrace.org. The way that started was that we had an entire body of research. This was years ago, kind of before CRT became the hot button issue, when parents during the COVID era were starting to realize what was happening with their children's public education was less than desirable and was probably even worse than that. So we had this whole body of research in which we had looked at the top, I think 125 schools is what we began with, colleges and universities in the United States, and we had cataloged what was happening on campuses in terms of their DEI CRT activities. And so rather than just publishing that as some kind of article or op-ed, we decided to turn that into a database. And since then, the database has grown substantially. And so we have databases which cover the military academies. We cover the elite private schools, is what we call them. Those are K through 12. But which cover the elite private schools, which are very important because those tend to be feeders for the Ivies, which then tend to be feeders to a lot of these upper echelon job openings upon graduation for these kids. So it's just kind of good to track that pipeline and see what's happening there. We have cataloged veterinary schools, which we did kind of as a joke, and found that 8 of the 11 all have some kind of DEI something happening in a substantial way on campuses. And these are people who treat your cats and dogs and whatever other livestock you have. So this stuff is everywhere. I think my point is here that and I think we know that on some level. I don't think we fully grasp the depth to which this has penetrated in every single aspect of our lives, not just education. Of course, for the purposes of our work, we focus on education. One of the things that I did want to bring up because it is very, I think, relevant to this particular discussion, and Bill touched on slightly. We've been writing about this for years, and it's the ways in which we have watched schools in particular um, sidestep some of the DEI regulations, whether it's happening at the state level or federal level. And ways that they've done that is they offload to third parties. We see this a lot where the money is going to consultants, and then the school can say, well, we're not actually hosting it. It's this other entity that's been contracted by whomever. And so they have a little bit of distance between that, which is part of why what Trump has done and with some of the audit that's happening with USAID and some of the other federal government entities is so important, because funding is being cut off to some of these third party things that I don't think any of us were aware we were actually funding with our tax money. So that's particularly important. Um, we've seen too where even on the AI front, we've written about this a lot as well, that there's certain quotas that are being built into artificial intelligence. We had dug into a situation even with LinkedIn where we had substantial evidence to suggest that it was likely that there were quotas happening so that you might not know if you were an employer, you might not know that certain candidates were being presented to you based on metrics with which you had not selected. And likewise, certain candidates were being left out. And as a candidate, you may not know that you weren't being presented if you did not meet certain DEI checkboxes. Um, so this is everywhere. We also see word games. Progressivism is fantastic at renaming things and rebranding things. We've seen this in many, many different fronts and many different battles publicly, even on the abortion front, right? No one ever calls it abortion anymore. It's always pro-choice, which of course sounds much more palatable than pro-abortion. So they're very, very good at coming up with terms that allow them to not just in the narrative side, but legally sidestep some of these requirements. And really, that's where we come in with the research that we're doing. We did publish a report last year where we looked at how higher education is rebranding DEI. And the results are exactly what you would expect, which is that's pretty much what they're doing. And so what we did is we started with states that had taken some kind of legislative action against DEI in higher education. And so from there, we looked at the largest schools in those states to see what, if anything, had changed post legislative action. And so, I mean, and we found what many netizens are finding as they're watching things happening on the federal level, where you might have the same person who's now in a different role with a very similar title, but there's no acronym mentioned. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what that person's job title is, whether they're doing the exact same job that they were doing before, but we've even seen the preemptive disbanding of departments. And we have people, I think it was one of the University of Arkansas satellites, we wrote about this 2 years ago, how they saw what was coming. And so they preemptively moved all of those administrators and the funding into different departments with different titles. They're still doing the same work, right? So, in some ways, that makes our job a little bit more difficult because we have to dig much, much further than we did before. But these are not isolated incidents. Um, I think in the report that we had published, we had someone from the University of Texas satellite campus saying that you just do it anyway. You just keep on doing it anyway, even if the state's saying you can't do it anymore. You just have to call it something different. So, again, on some level, I think we're aware of this, but as we're monitoring this, I think it's going to be very important. One of the things Bill did mention, we're currently working on finalizing a report. We do have a database that catalogs. We looked at the top 100 schools, just colleges and universities. And of those 100 schools, 53 of them had some kind of DEI certificate program. So that would not necessarily be your typical, I mean, it's not a degreed program. It's just an extra learning thing. They're typically marketed towards business professionals, um, and things like that. And so we had created a database to monitor which schools are doing that, the content of those programs, and are now just kind of following up to see. And I think one of the very important functions that we are able to work in a space where we're really able to make some ground and push for change here is to expose the gaps in what's happening legislatively or legally or execute on the executive side between what they're doing there and what's actually happening. And so we're still maintaining our databases there, but towards the end of last year, we really moved into more data analysis and digging into what's happening on some of these campuses. I think, especially as we're seeing more states going into this school choice battle. I know I'm in Texas, and right now we have a massive bill that's being pitched as school choice. It's not, though, it's just a subsidized voucher program. That finding out what's happening in the private school level is going to be increasingly more important, especially if they're now going to be getting state monies, which means that states have greater control over what happens in those schools. Um, but all of that to say, we have our work cut out for us, and I'm actually very excited that we have a situation now where we have known these things are happening. We've cataloged it. We have the evidence. We have all of the proof, which we've been telling people about for the last several years. And now we're able to track because we have historical record and we archive all of our links, which is also very helpful. We have historical record of what they were doing and can compare to what's happening now. And really looking down the road, that's what we'll be spending a lot of our time on the critical race project doing. And so I think in some ways results will be heartening, in some ways they won't, because as Bill has said, we're very aware of the fact that you cannot executive order away this ideology. It's so deeply entrenched. And the last thing I'll say before we move to questions is that we had done a report a couple of years ago where we looked at schools in California and we called it Who's Teaching the Teachers? And that's another important piece in this whole puzzle is that you have these teachers who are coming out of these schools and they're being educated and taught that these things are part of childhood development. This is not just an ideological thing, but they are being told that in order for children to progress properly as people, they must first value one another on race and be race conscious, and then, all of these other things that are kind of in that ball of wax. And so we have an entire generation of teachers now that has come through these kinds of training. And now they're in public schools, they're in private schools, they're in the education field, they're administrators. So this is not something that is a one-off fix. It's not something that Congress could even pass a bill and it goes away, because these people are still there thinking the things they're thinking, believing the things they're believing. And so I think in many ways our work is much more important now, than it was even before Trump was reelected and sworn in. So, do you have anything to add before?
Just one thing, and I do want to get to questions because there's a bunch in the Q&A. I see some people have their hands raised, but you have to ask a question through the Q&A portal. Let's not forget also what I'll call the lone wolves, okay? The teachers, you see them on TikTok all the time. You see libs of TikTok Twitter account exposing them. No matter what you do, this is so entrenched, you're going to find the libs of TikTok stars who will do whatever they want in the classrooms. Nonetheless, there's only so much you can do. So you do what you can do. But that just gets back to the point that if they're doing it now, they're going to continue doing it. And so let's get to some questions.
Okay, let's start. This is a great question. Bill, I'll give you this one. Will the Department of Education's OCR be sufficiently staffed to address the caseload of enforcing the limitations of DEI?
That's an open question. We don't know what's going to happen. It's one we think about a lot because so much of what we've done has used the mechanism of OCR, not so much their enforcement, but the mechanism that they have, which allows um, someone who does not have legal standing. So all of the 60 plus cases we've brought against OCR, we would need a plaintiff. We would need a student. We would need somebody with legal standing if we were to go to court. Very difficult to get. Anybody who practices in, conservative legal work knows it's very hard to find a plaintiff because they know there's going to be retribution. They know they'll never work again. They know they'll be harassed. Their family will be harassed. So having the OCR function is extremely important, whether it remains at Department of Education or it shifts over to Department of Justice. But even more so, as that question gets to than having the function, is will they staff it? In a period where they're cutting staff all over the place, it would be an empty gesture, I believe, for the administration to have OCR issue a directive as to how it's going to start enforcing these things, and then not staff OCR. So that's an open question, and I hope that the powers that be, if any of them are watching, will understand that if they're going to accomplish what they say they want to accomplish, it's not enough to issue an executive order. You need to enforce it, however that gets enforced. And you should not eliminate the ability of the public to alert you to enforcement issues. And that's the role that OCR has functioned. So I hope it continues. If it doesn't, I think it will severely damage the Trump administration's ability to get things done.
I completely agree. Completely agree. So next question is about K through 12. And so I do want to throw this out here before I get into this question just briefly. On the Critical Race Project, we've been asked many, many times why we don't cover K through 12. And the answer for that's pretty simple. First of all, there's over 14,000 public school districts in the United States, which is way more than what our researchers are able to cover realistically. Secondly, and probably most important, is that colleges love to brag about the things that they're doing that are woke in nature. They pride themselves in this. Schools try to hide it at this point because they know that this is not popular among most parents and most families, right? So it makes it much harder for us to find the information, to just easily access curriculum, to see what's happening, to peek inside the local school district and see what kinds of things they're teaching, what their priorities are, how deeply they've gone into social emotional learning, and all these other things. So that's a preface. This is a question. Many K through 12 school districts will seek to keep their DEI in programs, personnel, and curriculum. Tactically, even with pending lawsuits, would FOIA requests be helpful in getting lists of such items that fall within the contours of the DOE letter?
Well,
So
yeah,
we do
Freedom
have
of
experience.
Information Act requests held a lot of promise. I think most groups who practice in this area have been very frustrated and disappointed. Depending on the state you're in, like Rhode Island, you send a Freedom of Information Act, is called APRA request, and they get to charge you. And so they tell you, okay, we'll give you the records. It's going to be $3,000. Other states, they don't. So New York, they may have technically the ability to charge you, but they generally don't, in my experience. So it depends where you are. They're not fast remedies. You get things, although it's supposed to be within 10 or 20 business days, they have built-in extensions they can take, and they give you stuff heavily redacted. So it's not a great process. I've got to tell you that. It depends on the state, and we have had some success in some places, but it's not great. So yes, you need to do that. You can do that. You should be very cautious as to not to ask for too much, because if you ask for a boatload of stuff, they're going to want you to pay $50,000. So it has to be, and I know there are groups out there that have tips on FOIA requests, and you probably can find those through Google. So yes, FOIA requests are important to find out what's really happening, but it's not as easy as it sounds.
Well, or you might get an entire, I mean, one of the things we've seen too is they swamp you with information that you didn't ask, they don't go through it, or much of it's redacted. You just you just never know because this is not something that's requested often, and I think sometimes people get nasty about it and purposely give you really bad documents as a way to obfuscate. So, but you never know. You never know. Next question. Isn't DEI a rebranding term for affirmative action that has been judicially found unconstitutional?
Well, partially. Affirmative action typically is addressed, at least in education, to admissions decisions. DEI is much broader. So they're two different terms. I'd say affirmative action is maybe a subset of DEI. One of the problems we run into is definitional. The other side loves to argue with you over, well, what does critical race theory mean? Can you define it precisely? Um, you know, uh, that's not critical race theory. Critical race theory is only something taught in law schools. So definitionally, I would say affirmative action is a subset of DEI. It preceded DEI. Affirmative action has been around for decades in various forms. DEI is a newer terminology. And the way I distinguish it is critical race theory is the ideology, is the theory. DEI is how the theory gets put into practice. So critical race theory is, you know, an academic subject, but DEI are the programming, the trainings, the DEI statements, all of those things. So yes, it is a rebranding in a sense. And now they're not even using DEI anymore. DEI, just like CRT, has become a toxic term. Now they're calling it belonging and things like that. Cornell, I can't remember if it was
Accessibility. We're seeing a lot of accessibility,
accessibility.
which
Yes,
is sounds
and that's
really
one of
good.
the challenges. That's why it's not going away. They're going to call it something else. They're going to change the verbiage that gets used, but it's going to be the same old, same old. Again, you can't solve all the world's problems, but you can only solve the ones you can solve. And that's going to be one of the challenges.
Okay, so this one's a very specific one about Executive Order 14173, just so you're ready. How much has that particular order or the Justice Department memo already affected private corporations to either hide or shut down their own DEI programs? And is it likely to be challenged in court?
Um, yeah, that is the executive order from day two that addressed terminating affirmative action programs and also barring discrimination in contracting and grant making. I don't know whether that's been challenged yet. Um, in all of these things, you're going to have the private sector is going to have to modify its practices if it wants federal money. And as we know, a huge portion of the the private sector wants federal money. So yes, I think it will change behavior. But whether it's really changing the substance or it's changing the way it's phrased, I think that's the real question. But yes, I think that that executive order probably already has started companies taking down websites and hiring new consultants to reword everything. So yes, I think that one will have an impact.
Okay. Thank you. Um, since we have info on DEI and medical associations, do we have anything in psychological associations like the APA or other mental health and counseling fields? And so we have come adjacent to this a couple of times. And really what I did was a slow walk backwards because when we started to lift that lid, it is a whole world of things happening in public education that goes into all of the social emotional learning, that goes into all of these counselors that have access to your children, that they don't have to then share that information with parents. We are aware of at least some of that. We have not dug into that yet. And I feel like that would be its own project alone because the mental health world right now is just, we'll just say it's something else. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the battle ahead is going to be figuring out what's going on now that they're going to try to hide things.
Yes.
So that's where it is. And that's why it's not dead, because you've got the lone wolves, you've got the unions, and we haven't really even touched on teachers' unions. They are
Yeah.
the worst in pushing this stuff, not just what we call DEI and CRT, but pushing the anti-Israel stuff. The teachers' unions are completely weaponized. What's going on in Massachusetts is disgusting with the teachers' union there. So there is a huge fight ahead. I just have to emphasize that to people. Most people don't understand how thoroughly this stuff had permeated every level of education. And it's going to take, it took 20, 30 years to get here. Hopefully, it won't take 20, 30 years, but it's not going to be month one. I mean, tomorrow is 30 days. So a lot has been accomplished, and I don't want people to be down by the title of our webinar, but I want people to be realistic. Tremendous impact has been made. It's going to be felt even more as the money starts to run dry at a lot of these organizations, but you can't let your guard down. This is going to be a years-long fight.
Next question. Isn't K through 12 perhaps the most important area for DEI or anti-DEI emphasis? Throughout recent history, totalitarian rulers have focused on the very young, seeking to build a compliant populace from the ground up.
Well, K through 12 is where the fight is taking place now. It started on the campuses and it's worked its way down. It worked its way down in many ways through the teachers' unions, through the teachers' colleges, the teacher training programs. Yes, K through 12 is where the fight is. And I think it's, unfortunately, what I don't want to happen is the parents' movement is not what it was a couple of years ago. It just isn't. Some groups have closed, others have gone in another direction. But K through 12 is the fight. I think it's even more of a fight than the campuses.
Well, I would say though, an area where I am very heartened, I homeschool my kids. Um, and what I see and things that are not necessarily being covered by mainstream media and mainstream outlets is there is a massive resurgence. Homeschooling has just had a massive boom and post-COVID. And I don't think that's going to stop. I think there is enough concern by many, many people. No, I mean, obviously, that's not going to be everyone about what their kids are learning, not just educationally, not just meeting those certain metrics and being able to score on college entrance tests, but on who they're being shaped as people. And so I'm part of this, I guess, subsect of the population that's very involved in alternative education and promoting alternative education. And what I mean when I say alternative education is not government schools. Um, and really, and parents remembering that they are the ultimate autonomy, that they have the autonomy, they have the ultimate authority over their children and over the lives of their children, and that they are their children's best advocates. And we don't have to cede our children's hearts and minds to this kind of wokeism if we don't want to. It's not easy. It requires a lot in ways that just dropping them off at school may not. But there are ways to handle this that are basically creating an entire generation of kids, far more than what we've seen in the past, who are not going to be infected with these ideas as they grow up. And so I'm very heartened by that because it's not just me. And I live in a very tiny town in East Texas. It's not just me. I mean, it's millions and millions of people across the country who are engaging in a very similar lifestyle to what I've chosen for myself and my children. So there is that outside of just the K through 12 public bubble. Um, Speaking of children, I apologize. Mine are getting antsy in the background. Um, so next question, couldn't the Department of Education's OCR activity enforce Title IX absent SFFA? I'm not sure what does SFFA add to Title IX enforcement?
I don't think it adds anything really. Title IX would be sex discrimination. Uh, Students for Fair Admission, I don't believe addressed sex discrimination, so I don't think it really has an impact on Title IX. Haven't studied it. I might be wrong, but that's my quick take on it.
Let's see. We may go just a couple minutes over, y'all, because I'd like to get to as many questions as we can. Um, let's see. I don't know if you have any insight into this. This is not something I'm familiar with, but what about districts who've already conducted equity audits? Can they now not implement any findings from those audits?
Uh, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly might be something to raise with the Department of Education if they conducted an equity audit that now could not take place. Can they use that? That's an interesting question. I'm sure there's people who will go to school board meetings and ask that question. And I think it's a point, I don't think it would be an absolute bar to it because it's already taken place and you can't unknow what you've been told. But equity audits, I use the term the gateway drug. That's absolutely what they are. They're the pretext for pushing all this stuff into the curriculum.
Next question. Will these executive orders have an effect on public university DEI requirements as part of the school's required general education curriculum?
I think they might, as drafted, I think they might. Again, you're going to run into enforcement issues. You're going to run into challenges, First Amendment challenges as to what professors can teach. You're going to run into academic freedom challenges as to what autonomy professors have. So it could, uh, but if a school wants to fight it and fight it in court, I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be. There is this First Amendment doctrine of, compelled speech. Can the federal government compel people to say certain things in class or otherwise? And so I anticipate litigation there, but there will be a lot of schools who will simply comply rather than fighting it.
Right. Let's see. Can you speculate on using the False Claims Act against universities who claimed Title IX compliance for purposes of receiving federal funds and yet blatantly violated it?
Yeah, I mean that is a potential area of litigation. I'm not personally that familiar with the False Claims Act, but if the way I could see it panning out, if a university were receiving federal funds that it shouldn't be receiving because it has various aspects of its programming that's barred, um, and if you follow the procedures in the False Claims Act, and it's somewhat technical, um, what you have the ability to help the government recover that money, and you get a piece of it. Not 100% sure how all this works, but there are a lot of claims where whistleblowers on federal corruption programming enable the federal government to recover money from a company, and the whistleblower under the False Claims Act actually gets a cut of it. It's a very specialized area. It's one we've already begun to think about what role, if any, we can play in that. But those are the sort of things, and this is why I think it would be a mistake to defund OCR. Part of this is the federal government and the Trump administration is not going to have enough people to monitor all these things. You have to empower citizens, whether it's through a complaint procedure at OCR or whether it's through the Federal Claims Act or other ways. I would love you might need legislation, which probably would never pass, but I would love to broaden who has legal standing to change these things. So, the Trump administration, if anybody's listening or listening to the recording of this, think of ways you can empower the people to help you enforce these, race neutral criteria that you're insisting on. And False Claims Act might be one way.
So I have two more questions for you, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I know we're a few minutes over time here. What attacks are being pursued against the recent ABA requirement for accreditation of law schools, demanding racial components to instruction?
Yeah, that's been an up and down issue. The ABA had a rule that required diversity be one of the goals of the schools. Then they removed it, and I think they've added it back in. I think you're going to see, I would be shocked if you don't see the American Bar Association both on the receiving end of a Department of Justice investigation and having its exclusive accreditation power removed. People don't realize this. In order to get student loans as a student, law student, you need to go to an ABA accredited school in order to get federal student loans. So ABA has a stranglehold on accreditation. There's only a handful of schools that are not accredited by the ABA. And we actually raised this issue a while ago. I'm trying to remember the context, but we tried, I know I wrote about it. I think we sent letters. We tried to get attention to this 2, 3, 4 years ago that the ABA stranglehold needs to be removed. And I think that's going to happen. I think that's going to happen because they become too political. And people, there was a time 40, 50 years ago when the ABA was a rough proxy for the American legal lawyers, American lawyers. It's not anymore. I think about 10% of lawyers are now members of the ABA. It used to be 50 or 60%. So they don't represent the American legal community. They've been removed from their role in vetting Republican judicial nominees because they were viewed as biased. I think the ABA is going to be on the receiving end of an investigation and they're going to lose their accreditation power. And once they lose that accreditation exclusive power, they're going to be much less influential.
Last question for you. Do you anticipate the Jewish students' lawsuits against universities like Harvard and other Ivies will have a big impact on DEI programs at the university and K through 12 level?
Uh, Hard to say. Uh, Very hard to say. I think they've had some impact, but it's somewhat a different set of issues than the issues we've been discussing right now. There is a separate executive order on anti-Semitism. There will be separate enforcement. I don't know, as somebody who's against the DEI programming, I've never believed that the answer is to expand DEI programming to treat Jews as a separate category. So I'm not sure that's really an answer. It may, in fact, happen. Okay, schools may do that. In fact, Cornell did that after October 7th. When the then president, now former president, issued a ridiculous statement after October 7th. And there was such an uproar that said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to add anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to our DEI programming. And that's not the answer. So it might have an impact, but I'm not sure it's an impact we really want. We may have to fight anti-Semitism in a different way rather than, buttressing the DEI bureaucracy by saying, let's add another group into it.
No, thank you for that. So I think that concludes our question and answers for today. Question we always get, yes, this is being recorded. Yes, we will post it live to the blog, usually sometime within the week. So just check legalinsurrection.com for that. We also put it in our morning insurrection newsletter that goes out Monday through Friday mornings. So be sure to look for it there. And if you're not signed up, I promise we don't spam you. We never sell lists. We don't buy lists. We don't do any of those kinds of things. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. And so we also run a very lean organization, and that's by design, so that every dollar that we get, we can put right back into the work we're doing. We can pay the researchers, we can pay the attorneys, and we can keep making strides forward to push back against this pernicious ideology in any way that we're able to. And of course, I'll end with my parting spiel, which is don't wait for someone else to do this. Don't wait for us to do it. In whatever sphere of influence you have, get involved. And that doesn't include yelling at people on Facebook, but just get involved and in your communities. And it doesn't have to be on a national scale, but if everyone were to take seriously some of the challenges that we're facing and try to do something about it, even in a small way, we would have a very different country. And now is the time. Like, now is the time. So if I hope that you found this helpful, encouraging in some ways to at least know that though the situation remains dire, we are here and we are fighting, but we need help. We need all the help we can get across the board. So we appreciate you. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your time today. And we thank you for being part of what we do. Um, and like I said, we'll be sending this to y'all later if you attended. Um, and if you have any other questions, you can email us at info@legalinsurrection.com. So thank you again for coming, and we will see y'all next time. Bye-bye.